booties for black girl nerds.
Hi, Sonia. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you. I like your background. It looks very tropical.
Oh my gosh. So I just started house sitting for my sister, and I got here last night and I was like, where am I going to sit for the Zoom calls? Like, I guess I'm going to be in a jungle.
It looks really cool. It looks very nice. But I thank you for this time to discuss Black Boys. You know, I found it very intriguing and almost a little provocative, but in a good way, because it's taking an approach that you don't normally hear when you're referring to Black boys, Black bodies, and how they maneuver through society. What was your early inspiration for crafting this, and how did you decide on how you would arc the storytelling for this documentary?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the backdrop of it was I did my first film about school segregation and studying educational inequality in our school systems, and was meeting a lot of young Black men or Black boys through that, as well as Black girls, Black women. But I didn't know that, you know, I was talking to one guy who was a big part of that first film, Teach Us All, and he was about 18 years old. He was from Little Rock, Arkansas, and he said, you know, growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in, you could be, you know, four things. You had four options. You could be a dope dealer, a sports player, or end up dead or incarcerated. And that's what he saw. Like a lot of, you know, I mean, he went to funerals in his teens, like number of, like, you know, his peers passed away, and he ended up himself going to the military. But I was already kind of thinking about the opportunity gap that Black boys face. But this was around 2017. And so that film, Teach Us All, was acquired by Ava DuVernay, who did 13th. And she talked about, you know, the connection between education and criminal justice. But the sports activism was happening. It was Take a Knee. There was all this stuff on the headlines about sports. So I really felt like between hearing what that young man had said about, you know, you could become a sports player or a dope dealer, that really like kind of stuck with me. And then watching the activism and the backlash to the athletes, like really playing out on the national stage, it really got me thinking about this question of humanity and, you know, why was there so much backlash against these athletes? Why was there so much desensitivity and sometimes indifference to the deaths of Black men at the hands of police? And, you know, do white people not see the full humanity of Black people and Black men in particular? And so I just felt like I wanted to make something that was, like you said, a little different, like, you know, that wasn't as much about the policies and the statistics, although that takes, you know, that is a part of Black boys. I really felt like what was missing was something that really humanizes. And so I wanted to create something that was really beautiful, that was really honoring of their humanity, and really talked about the internal landscape instead of just the things that come at Black men and boys from the outside, but really what does it feel like to walk through the world? And what are the things you've been told that you've internalized? How do you rewrite that narrative, reimagine what's possible? All this kind of interior stuff. I wanted to traverse that, and I didn't really see much of that out there. So that was a really long answer.
No, I appreciate that, because that's exactly what I wanted to know. I found it was very intriguing to me how candid it was, because you usually don't hear it from that perspective, from the young people telling you firsthand that these were the options that were presented to them, or being told, or young Black boys who might have white mothers being emotionally affected by white women retracting from them in fear when that's not the experience that they have in the home. And these are just conversations that we in the Black community might have amongst ourselves, but we don't necessarily see them presented on a bigger stage like that for other people to consume. When you were crafting this, how did you envision like your intended art audience? Was it more of a Black people, I see you and the stories are being told to me? Is it more non-Black people? Here is something a little bit more educational so you can understand the nuance of what people are saying. What did you envision as your ideal audience for this?
I mean, I think, it helped that we had a multifaceted team, because I think we all had sort of, different sort of missions and intentions that all were complementary. I mean, certainly, the quick answer is I wanted everybody to see it. Every American needs to see this film. I think it's absolutely critical, but it was kind of going back and forth in many ways as a conversation, that we want, of course, I think it's really important for Black men and boys to see it, and Black women, girls to see it, in terms of the kind of, the honesty, the vulnerability, like you said, that the kind of the rawness, the emotion, like seeing a big, strong Black man like Greg Scruggs cry, like that's very powerful, I hope, for young Black boys to see, and to know it's okay to have those emotions that they're obviously feeling, but don't often get to see depicted on mainstream media. And so there absolutely is that intention of, the Black boy and the Black man sort of seeing this film, and the Black community in general. But definitely big driving force for me was for white people to see it. And as a white woman, obviously, like I really wanted to really unpackage and decondition, what I had learned about Black men. And so that was a big part of it too, is because when I was asking those questions of like, do white people not see the full humanity of Black men? I had to ask myself that question. And, even being an activist, working in education, being progressive, all these things, parents marched to the civil rights movement, all this stuff, I was like, well, I mean, I've only ever lived in very white neighborhoods. I've gone to really white schools. I don't know hardly any Black men. And so even though I ideologically, believe in the equality of all people, I physiologically, because of the segregation and the separation in this country and the conditioning that everybody receives, but especially white people receive about Black men, there's this discomfort. The stuff that I, bring up in the film is, that kind of crossing the street, or maybe, so I really wanted to face that, confront that and make that a big part of the conversation, in hopes that, other white women and other white people might see a little bit of that in themselves. Like, I don't think I'm a racist, but do I do that? Do I cross the street? Do I like clutch my purse? I'm hoping that we can start to ask these questions, because I think we really need to, like you said, it's a conversation that needs to be happening with Black and white people together, not just in silos, because white people don't want to talk about it. Like, white people will never want to admit this stuff, and then we don't often hear what Black people are talking about. And so I think for me, it was really about having this cross-racial conversation and breaking down a lot of the conditioning, but then sort of like the denial, like, oh, I'm not a racist, just whatever. We want to kind of avoid these uncomfortable conversations. How do we have them, but in a soft, forgiving, humanizing way? So I think that's an important part of it too, is like, how do we invite people closer in, instead of just turning people off and polarizing and, creating more fear and mistrust,
Right. Yeah, that was probably the most provocative thing about it for me. And that I found it very enjoyable, that it was just so candid, just like you spoke to right now, just your own sphere of living, where, I mean, you're obviously not racist, but your immediate surrounding is not as diverse, and not by particularly any choosing of your own, but just the way that this country is arranged. And for the melting pot and the things that people like in this country too, it's more like a salad. Someone gave me that analogy before. Instead of more of a melting pot, it's more of a salad. It might be in the same bowl, but there's carrots and there's onions and there's lettuce, and and it's not really joining with each other. It's just kind of laying on top of each other. And I appreciated that your project explored those types of things, and really feelings that non-Black people might have, but that they feel uncomfortable sharing. In addition to the young people that you interviewed, I like the adding of Carmelo Anthony and Vic Mensa and other people who participated in the project, sharing their own experiences of having to get out there and let people know that they're still part of the community. Even though they made it, they're still part of the community, and how there's no equity in the fact that you might have one Black millionaire, but you've got a million people who are still living in poverty. What were some of those conversations like with Carmelo and Vic and the other celebrity guests who appeared in the project?
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I really wanted to bring sports into the conversation. I think it's a really critical part of this discussion, but I actually don't watch sports myself. And so I didn't really know who any of these athletes were going into these conversations, actually. So, I really wanted to talk to them about their humanity, I guess, like in their experiences, especially. So for me, like a Carmelo, I didn't really know who he was too much. I, maybe had heard of him, but so it was much more interesting for me to see how kind of open and vulnerable he was, talking about being a kid and what it felt like when he talks about that, like the feelings inside his body, when you're like holding all this in that you're seeing. I mean, it's technically, it's trauma that he's experiencing and that he's repressing and you're holding in. And I just thought it was just really, interesting to kind of, no matter who I spoke to, no matter what age, no matter what socioeconomic status, no matter what, environment they'd grown up in, this question of like, when did you know you were a Black boy? I could ask this question, and from a 10-year-old to an 80-year-old, it would kind of be like, but especially the older men who hadn't really reflected on that in a really long time, but remembering like, there was always a moment, and often a very traumatizing moment where being a Black boy became kind of very clear to them. They went from being a child, just a free, innocent child, to either being called the N-word by somebody, or, a white female teacher, looking at them a certain way or saying something to them, whatever it was, there was always this moment, and that it was suddenly very clear, like, oh, I'm a Black boy, and Black boy means something in America, and often it's not a good thing. And so that, that experience is so universal that, like, it's, talking to a Vic, talking to a Carmelo was no different than talking to anybody else, because they all had that experience. They all had this kind of like pain around internalizing how the world had defined them and how they're trying to find their way and define themselves in the midst of, that. And so the hope is that as we unpackage that, we can reimagine that, and the Greg Scruggs relationship with his son, was so important to me at that sort of 2-year-old age where Coven turns 2 at the end of the movie, because that's really like, psychologically or from a neuroscience standpoint, when children start to like learn about who they are from the outside world and start listening to the messages that are told about who they are. And so for me, it was listening to Greg say, you can be great, you can be anything you want to be. Like, that's the messaging society needs to be giving to Black boys. So he was sort of symbolic of that, retraining we kind of need to do collectively in the messaging that we need to be giving, all the children in this country. So it was interesting.
Sonia, I really like this. I really enjoyed the project. I love the different aspects that it was touching upon, because I heard a lot of things that I know, being a Black person, being from an urban community. I live in Inglewood, and knowing these things, but never really hearing them talked about outside of the home, sort of a thing. And I applaud you for that, and just bringing these discussions to the forefront. It almost reminded me of something like scholarly, like something children should watch in school, no matter who they are. And just your approach to the storytelling was just very refreshing, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're definitely doing, educational distribution. I mean, we think every teacher should watch it, every student should watch it. But it's exciting that it, got distribution on Peacock, because like I said, I really wanted also just sort of everybody, especially sort of the NBC audience of white people to see this, and hopefully we'll be able to reflect a little bit. I mean, the whole point is to reflect it. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely making sure it gets in the schools, but I'm hopeful that it can reach everyone or as many people as possible.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you so much for your time. I really, really enjoyed it. Congratulations to you on landing it on Peacock, and I look forward to seeing more of your projects in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Better shake your booties for black girl nerves. Better shake your booties for black girl nerves.